December 22, 1922, Lenox Avenue, Harlem. The most powerful woman in Harlem sat in the back of a Cadillac and made a decision that would reshape the criminal underworld for the next 4 decades. She chose him. Not because he was the toughest. Harlem had plenty of muscle. Not because he was connected. He had no family ties to power. She chose Ellsworth Bumpy Johnson because in 3 years of watching him operate, she'd seen something that couldn't be taught and rarely survived the streets. Intelligence masked as violence. Strategy disguised as instinct. And most importantly, the ability to think 3 moves ahead while everyone else was still fighting over the last one. This is Episode 3, Queen of Numbers. According to later accounts from people who worked in Stephanie St. Clair's organization, that December meeting wasn't accidental. She'd been tracking Bumpy Johnson for months, not following him personally but receiving reports, who he worked for, how he handled problems, whether he used more force than necessary or less. The policy banking business required enforcers. Every operation did. Men who could collect debts, protect runners, discourage competition. But St. Clair wasn't looking for another enforcer. She was building something larger, more sophisticated, an organization that could survive not just street-level threats, but challenges from the Italian mob, corrupt police, and political machines that had crushed every other black-owned operation in the city. For that, she needed someone who could evolve, someone who understood that real power wasn't about who could hit the hardest, but who could see the game within the game. The meeting itself, according to those who heard about it later, was brief but direct. St. Clair didn't waste time on flattery or explanation. She told the 17-year-old standing beside her car that she had work for him. Better pay than Bub Hewlett could offer, more responsibility, more risk. But also, she made clear, more rules. Work for her meant showing up on time, staying sober on the job, following orders exactly as given, and most critically, understanding that violence was a tool to be used precisely, not a solution to be applied everywhere. Bumpy, according to later accounts, asked only one question. What would he be learning? That question, more than anything else about their first meeting, convinced St. Clair she'd made the right choice. Most young enforcers wanted to know how much they'd be paid. Bumpy wanted to know what he'd gain beyond money. She told him the truth. If he was smart, if he paid attention, if he survived, he'd learn how to build and run an empire that white organized crime couldn't touch. He started work the next morning. Stephanie St. Clair, known throughout Harlem as Madame Queen, or simply Queenie, was unlike any criminal operator Bumpy had encountered. Born in Martinique, she'd arrived in Harlem in 1912 with nothing. By 1922, she controlled a policy banking operation that generated hundreds of thousands of dollars annually. But it wasn't just the money that made her remarkable. In an era when women, especially black women, were systematically excluded from economic and political power, St. Clair had built an organization that employed hundreds, provided financial services to thousands, and challenged both white criminal enterprises and corrupt government institutions. She'd taken the NYPD to court over illegal arrests and won, exposing police corruption in the process. She'd refused protection money demands from Italian mobsters and survived their retaliation. She ran her operation with military precision, kept meticulous financial records, and paid her people well enough that loyalty was more profitable than betrayal. Working for her meant entering a different world than the street-level hustling Bumpy had known. His first assignment, according to later accounts, wasn't enforcement at all. St. Clair put him on a collection route. Every day for 3 months, Bumpy walked a specific circuit through Harlem, visiting shops, restaurants, barbershops, and private homes. At each stop, he collected policy slips and the money attached to them. It seemed simple. Take the bets. Bring back the cash. But St. Clair was teaching him to see the architecture beneath the obvious. She'd assigned him one of the most profitable routes in her operation. Every location he visited was carefully chosen. Every runner he interacted with served a specific function. The whole system operated like a well-designed machine where every part had to work perfectly, or the entire mechanism would fail. Bumpy learned to recognize which locations were bringing in steady money versus which ones were declining. He started noticing patterns in betting behavior. He saw how certain runners were skimming, taking small amounts they thought wouldn't be noticed. After 3 months, St. Clair called him to her office in a building on 137th Street. She asked him what he'd learned. According to later accounts, Bumpy didn't talk about the money he'd collected or the runners he'd supervised. He talked about the 3 locations that were underperforming and why. He identified 2 runners who were stealing and explained exactly how much they were taking. He suggested changes to the route that would increase efficiency. St. Clair listened without interruption. When he finished, she made him a collection supervisor. He was 18 years old. The numbers game, as Bumpy learned it from St. Clair, was more complex than it appeared from the outside. On the surface, it seemed simple. People bet small amounts on 3-digit numbers. If their number hit, they won big. If it didn't, the house kept their money. But the real business wasn't the betting. It was the infrastructure required to make the betting possible. St. Clair employed dozens of runners who collected bets throughout Harlem. Each runner had to be reliable, discreet, and honest enough not to steal more than a reasonable amount. She operated multiple policy banks where the money was counted, recorded, and secured. These locations had to be defended against robbery, raids, and competition. She maintained relationships with legitimate businesses that provided cover for the operation. Barbershops, restaurants, and social clubs where betting happened but looked like normal commerce. She paid police officers, precinct captains, and political operatives to ensure the operation could continue without constant legal harassment. And she managed all of this while competing against other policy bankers, fending off Italian mob attempts to take over, and dealing with the reality that any day could bring a raid that would shut everything down. What Bumpy learned from watching her operate was that the violence everyone saw was actually the smallest part of the business. The real work was organization, systems, relationships, information. St. Clair knew which police officers could be bought and which ones were too honest or too ambitious. She knew which politicians needed money for campaigns and which ones would take the money then betray her anyway. She understood that paying her employees well created loyalty more effectively than fear ever could. She taught Bumpy to see crime not as a series of individual scores, but as an ongoing enterprise that required the same kind of strategic thinking that any business needed. By 1924, at age 19, Bumpy was managing enforcement for 3 of St. Clair's most profitable districts. His job, according to later accounts, required judgment more than violence. When runners were stealing, he had to decide whether to fire them, threaten them, or in extreme cases, use force. Making the wrong choice could create problems worse than the original theft. When competitors tried to move into St. Clair's territory, he had to assess whether they were serious threats or opportunistic amateurs. Overreacting could start wars. Underreacting could encourage more challenges. When police demanded larger payments than agreed upon, he had to know whether they were bluffing or whether refusing would bring raids that would cost more than just paying. St. Clair let him make these decisions, but she reviewed every choice. When he got it right, she explained why. When he got it wrong, she explained the consequences and what he should have done differently. The education was brutal, but effective. Bumpy learned that information was more valuable than force. Knowing that a competitor was about to make a move meant you could counter it before it happened. Knowing which police officer was about to transfer meant you could cultivate his replacement before he arrived. He learned that loyalty had to be earned through consistency, paying people fairly, treating them with respect, and following through on promises created more reliable organizations than fear ever could. But he also learned that when violence was necessary, it had to be precise, overwhelming, and designed to send a message that would prevent future problems. By 1926, Bumpy had survived what most young enforcers didn't, the transition from muscle to management. At 21, he was running significant parts of St. Clair's operation. He supervised dozens of employees. He handled negotiations with rival policy bankers. He managed relationships with police and politicians. And he was learning to see patterns that would serve him for the rest of his life. One pattern in particular was becoming impossible to ignore. The Italian mob wanted Harlem. Not just access to Harlem, not just a percentage of Harlem's profits. They wanted to own it, control it, operate it the way they controlled the Lower East Side and parts of Brooklyn. What St. Clair understood, and what white gangsters like Dutch Schultz consistently underestimated, was that Harlem wasn't a territory you could simply seize, it was a system you had to survive. Dutch Schultz, a white gangster whose real name was Arthur Flegenheimer, had been watching Harlem's policy operations for years. He understood the mathematics. Tens of thousands of black workers betting nickels and dimes every day generated hundreds of thousands of dollars in profit annually. And unlike bootlegging or other rackets, the numbers game was steady, predictable, and relatively low risk if you could manage the political side. But there was a problem. Black operators like St. Clair, Casper Holstein, and others controlled the policy banks. They'd built the infrastructure. They had the trust of the community. They knew how to operate in Harlem in ways that white gangsters didn't. Schultz's solution was direct. He'd approach each black policy banker with a simple offer. Partner with him, give him control, and they could continue working for him as managers. Or refuse and face systematic violence until they either submitted or were destroyed. According to later accounts, Schultz sent representatives to St. Clair in early 1927. The meeting was professional. They made their offer. They explained the benefits of cooperation and the consequences of refusal. St. Clair, according to people who were present, listened politely. Then she refused, not because she was brave or foolish, but because she'd done the same calculation that Schultz had done, and she'd reached a different conclusion. If she partnered with Schultz, she'd survive in the short term, but lose her business in the long term. He'd slowly push her out, take over her operations, and eventually she'd be working for him with no real power. If she refused, there would be violence. People would get hurt. She might lose. But there was also a chance, if she played it right, if she had the right people around her, if she was willing to fight strategically rather than just react, that she could survive long enough for circumstances to change. Italian mobsters had enemies. Police had quotas. Politicians had elections. Nothing was permanent in the underworld. The question was whether she could hold out until Schultz faced problems of his own. For that, she needed smart, loyal, ruthless people who understood that this wasn't just a street fight. It was a war of attrition that would be won by whoever could outlast the other. She looked at Bumpy Johnson, now 22 years old, and made another decision that would reshape both their futures. She was going to fight, and he was going to be her general. The period between 1927 and 1928 marked a fundamental shift in Bumpy's role within St. Clair's organization. He was no longer just enforcement. He was strategy. St. Clair explained the situation with complete honesty. Dutch Schultz was coming. He had more men, more money, more political connections, and fewer moral constraints than they did. The only advantages they had were knowledge of Harlem, community support, and the willingness to fight in ways that Schultz wouldn't expect. This wasn't going to be a traditional gang war with shootouts and body counts. That would just get them all killed or arrested. This was going to be about making Schultz's takeover so expensive, so complicated, so problematic for his other operations, that he'd eventually decide Harlem wasn't worth the trouble. Bumpy's job was to organize the defense. According to later accounts, he approached it the way St. Clair had taught him to approach everything, systematically. First, they identified every policy banker in Harlem who would be targeted by Schultz. Some would fold immediately, some would fight, some were uncertain. Bumpy met with each one, not to threaten them, but to explain reality. Schultz was coming for everyone. They could surrender individually and lose everything, or they could coordinate and maybe survive. Second, they identified every location where Schultz's people would try to establish operations. The goal wasn't to stop them everywhere, but to make certain key territories so difficult to operate in that Schultz would have to invest disproportionate resources just to maintain a presence. Third, they cultivated relationships with the community. Harlem residents largely supported black-owned policy operations over white takeovers. That support could be translated into intelligence about where Schultz's people were operating, who was working for them, and what they were planning. And fourth, they prepared for violence, not initiating it, but ready to respond when Schultz's people inevitably decided that intimidation and force were more efficient than negotiation. St. Clair gave Bumpy authority to make decisions in the moment without consulting her. In a fight that could turn on hours or minutes, waiting for approval could mean losing. It was a remarkable show of trust for a 22-year-old who 5 years earlier had been shining shoes at Penn Station. But St. Clair understood what few other criminal operators did. Age and experience mattered less than intelligence, judgment, and the ability to think clearly under pressure. Bumpy had proven he had all three. By the end of 1928, the conflict with Dutch Schultz was no longer a possibility. It was reality. Schultz's men were operating in Harlem. They were intimidating policy bankers. They were beating runners who wouldn't work for them. They were trying to establish control through the same methods they'd used successfully in other parts of the city. But Harlem was different. St. Clair's organization didn't break, didn't surrender, didn't collapse under the initial pressure. Instead, they fought back intelligently, not with random violence, but with strategic resistance designed to make every block Schultz took cost him more than it was worth. And leading that resistance was Bumpy Johnson. He was 23 years old. He'd been in New York for 9 years. He'd survived poverty, violence, reform school, and the brutal education of Harlem streets. But more importantly, he'd been taught by one of the most strategic criminal minds in the city how to think about power, organization, and survival. The war with Dutch Schultz would define the next phase of his life. It would test everything St. Clair had taught him. It would require him to be more than just muscle or even management. It would require him to be what St. Clair had been training him to become all along. A leader who understood that real power wasn't about controlling territory. It was about controlling the game itself. According to people who worked with Bumpy during this period, there was a moment in late 1928 when the full weight of what was coming became clear. St. Clair called him to her office, just the two of them, no one else present. She told him that what was about to happen would be the most dangerous thing either of them had faced. People would die. They might die. There were no guarantees. But, she said, there was something important he needed to understand. She hadn't chosen him 6 years ago because he was tough or smart or loyal, though he was all of those things. She'd chosen him because she saw in him something rare. The ability to become what Harlem needed but didn't yet have. Not just another gangster, not just another enforcer for white organized crime, but a black man who could build and defend power in a city designed to deny it to him. She told him she believed he could do that. But he had to survive what was coming first. Then she sent him out to prepare for war. And Bumpy Johnson, at 23 years old, walked out of that office understanding something fundamental about the path his life had taken. He wasn't working for Stephanie St. Clair anymore. He was being prepared to replace an entire generation. The question was whether he'd live long enough to become it.